In the period after the Renaissance, we see a number of changes taking place in Europe, among them political change. This image is a fresco. It was painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in the 14th century, and he's illustrating the nobility holding court. During this period, we see numerous beginnings of overseas exploration. Overseas explorations were an opportunity for countries and their kingdoms to begin to have economic exploration of other areas and to begin to bring back new and interesting materials. Well, in order to do so, there's a requirement for map making, there was a requirement for navigation instruments. We began to see the development of new weapons. The governments themselves were encouraging this colonization, and they benefited from all of the return materials that came back to the original country. The movement of individuals and the introduction of new ideas led to a variety of social changes. We see the introduction of new herbs and medicines from a variety of other places. At the time, Europe may have become somewhat overcrowded. Certain people were being persecuted, and they wished the freedom to escape from what was going on in their immediate area. And so, as a result of the things that were coming back, we see the introduction, for example, of the Peruvian bark, that it becomes a treatment for malaria and fever because of its quinine component. But we see disease being brought back from the New World as well. It's believed that Columbus's sailors brought syphilis back to the European continent. The image you see in the lower right is presumed to be Columbus leaving with Ferdinand and Isabella on the dock. The Spanish rulers were the ones who sponsored his first expedition, and the rivalries from one country to another to see who might control these colonies became an important aspect of this period. Well, we see here a few dates. Columbus, 1492. Relatively quickly thereafter, in 1497, Vespucci, who had no confusion about arriving at India, he named the place they found the New World, rather than describing it as the West Indies. You see here a cross that is found in the museum in Mexico. It was clearly produced before 1556, and it's an example of the blending of European features with the features that one found in the New World. By 1513, we see Balboa, who crosses the Isthmus of Panama. He claims the Pacific Ocean on behalf of Spain, and by 1519, Ferdinand Magellan has sailed completely around South America into the Pacific, across the Pacific, and claims the Philippines on behalf of Spain. Well, the modern study of anthropology has its origins as the Europeans began to explore and colonize other lands in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, around the Pacific. They began to encounter other cultures, totally different people with completely different styles of life, dependence on different plant materials and so forth. And the interest to understand this diversity became a part of the original goals of anthropology. And so we see things such as the introduction of the Europeans bringing their diseases, such as smallpox, into the New World, killing untold numbers of people. And the reverse, the syphilis that was brought back from the New World to Europe, altering the life of the Europeans. Well, an unsavory element of what was happening in those same time frames is the development of the slave trade. The Portuguese sent traders and missionaries to Africa. Eventually the Portuguese enslaved Africans in order to support their other empires around the world in Africa and Brazil and the Caribbean. And the slave trade grew to spread really throughout Europe. What you see in the image here are it's a performance from Burkina Faso. This is the Bois culture. The photograph actually dates from 1984, but these are masks that were developed in the late 1800s. The Bois became the targets of slave trade, and they began to develop these rituals in order to defend against slavers and to protect their people in the face of this threat. This is, the anthropologists tell us, one particularly documented example of the many that might be found of the creation of different types of traditions that arose directly from the imposition of the slave trade. Well, commerce and trade require completely different ways of handling interactions. Barter had been a principal way of addressing the movement of goods and services in the world previously. But by this time, the requirements of trade and commerce encouraged the development of banks. Banks were first begun in the Middle Ages, but they grew in importance during the early years of the Renaissance. And the Medici family, of course, is one of the most prominent and famous banking families. They used the wealth that they acquired to support the arts and as well as to gain political power. This is a 14th century painting in which we see people depositing and withdrawing money from an Italian bank. Well, Venice, of course, was one of the principal locations of this trade and commerce, and as it developed, the cities that supported it also developed. Italy, of course, was one of the great locations for these kinds of developments, and here you see the Doge Palace in Venice. It still exists today. The Doge were the governors. They were elected leaders of the Venetian Republic, and the present palace that you see here dates back to the early 14th century. It had been damaged several times, but ultimately we see the support of a building of this quality and character being decorated by leading artists of the time. In this case, in the 16th century, we see works by Titian and Tintoretto and Paolo Veronese. Here you see a painting. This is the arrival of the ambassadors. The Venetian artist this time is Vittorio Carpaccio. Venice, like many other states in Italy during the Renaissance, competed. They competed for prestige and political strength. They relied on their diplomats. Sometimes they would be going to war, but they would be receiving ambassadors as if it was an entire republic. It was a city-state, if you will, and because of its commerce and the development of the economy that surrounded that, its strength was powerful and might be comparable to what we would think of today as a country. Well, we began to see in this time frame the development of monarchies becoming stronger than the feudal lords in smaller areas. This painting is from 1469. This is by Jean Fouquet, and it features Louis XI. He's the King of France, and he was considered one of the new monarchs. Well, the new monarchs were the ones who began to strengthen their control over their area and to bring the allegiance of the dukes and others that previously had relatively strong power and began to centralize the power instead of having it decentralized in the feudal areas. Others, we see here Charles VIII. He was the King of France who invaded Italy. For a time he captured Naples in 1495. It was the beginning of a whole series of invasions into Italy that would ultimately last 50 years or more. Henry VII ascended to the throne of England. It was about 1485. He married Elizabeth of York a year later. That marked the end of the War of the Roses. The Yorks had previously been pitted against Henry's family, the Lancasters. So the Yorks and the Lancasters essentially brought an end to their to their warring when Henry married Elizabeth. Well, Henry allied himself with the growing urban population to try to increase his power over the nobility. Again, the feudal lords, if you will. Now, this particular image was an anonymous portrait of his. It sits in the Royal Society of Arts in London. Henry VIII is very well known for his marriages and other things. He's the subject of many popular movies and pieces of fiction, really, that are not truly historical. The portrait that you see of him here is by Hans Holbein the Younger. Henry was born in 1491. He became king when he was only 18. He instantly married his brother's widow, and that became the beginning of his entrance into a very large intrigue of European politics. In spite of enormous sums of money, lots of diplomatic efforts, many battles, it turns out that his foreign policy really made little difference. It was domestic policies, however, that totally changed the course of English history. He had been disturbed and wished to annul his first marriage, and upon being refused by the Catholics, he eventually challenged the authority of the Pope. He declared himself the supreme leader of the Church in England. He was excommunicated. Ultimately, this is the origin of the Anglican Church, and another of the branches of the difference where the anguish between Protestants and Catholics began. Well, he died in 1547. He left principally a bankrupt nation. Henry had married Catherine to maintain an alliance with Spain. When Henry married Catherine, he was hoping to have a son to provide a male heir to the throne, but his advisors told him that they believed Catherine to be past the age of childbirth. So Henry tried every way he could to persuade her to become a nun. Instead, Catherine refused, and after 2 years of arguments with the Pope, Henry created a new archbishop. This was Thomas of Canterbury, who was prepared to declare the marriage annulled in 1532. Catherine was then banished from the court. She was separated from her daughter, and it is ultimately said that she died of a broken heart. Well, what was going on with medicine at the time? The Renaissance had an effect on medicine. There were all sorts of advances, and we began to see some learning taking place as people encountered new things. At the time, people commonly believed in witches. There were good witches and bad witches. They were thought to be able to fly on broomsticks, and they influence things by sticking pins in dolls. These types of beliefs still persist. We see them in our contemporary movies and so forth. Many people, especially an old widow, might have been seen as a good witch until their relationship with a neighbor went bad, and then they became called bad witches. And witches were sometimes hunted by mobs. Mobs of people would attack these persons. And the religious leaders absolutely supported the attacks. It seems that witches were believed to be rivals to the formal religion, and for that reason the religious leaders really did not find a reason to want to stop this type of behavior. But at the same time, religion, organized religion, formal religion, remained very important to the sick. The last rites were performed. There were prayers to saints. People made pilgrimages. There were all sorts of votive offerings, sacraments, and a variety of techniques such as anointing the sick. Well, at this point we're still unable to do a great deal in terms of advanced medicine, so a large part of what medicine is offering is the comfort of the soul. since the Protestants were not believers of purgatory, the prayers for the dead and the Requiem Mass ultimately became obsolete for their portion of the world. Medicine as practiced in the Renaissance featured a variety of interesting things. We know that they used a great deal of bloodletting. This unfortunately led and contributed to a great deal of the hospital mortality. We also know that they used mercury and lead in a variety of things, and today we know that that is not a positive choice of methods. Things like diet, exercise, hygiene, and the ability to use purges of various sorts did in fact make a difference. They used opium to reduce pain, and we see them using willow bark, which has salicin in it. That's an ingredient very similar to aspirin, and to this very day, foxglove, which is the source for digitalis, is still used to treat heart disease. In the case of surgery, we saw that war and the use of these new weapons began to bring different developments. Surgeons began to have to learn how to deal with gunshot wounds, and they began to learn how to create emergency treatments. And by this time, it was okay to do a great deal more in the study of anatomy. So you see here an image from an engraving of about 1597. These are two surgeons who are amputating the leg and the arm of a patient. This is an image that shows birthing situation. You see the woman being attended by a midwife, and you see a preparation of a bath for the infant. In the background there's an astrologer who is studying the stars. It's often thought that the moment of birth and the alignment of the stars at that point had some sort of an astrological influence on the child. So this becomes an interesting image that shows the mix of the old thoughts about astrology with the newer behavior for medicine. This is by Jacob Ruysch. It's called De Conceptu et Generation Hominis. We think it's from 1580. Well, the plague continues to ravage Europe. The last severe Western outbreak was in the 1720s in France. They had a whole raft of common diseases that we would recognize today. Some of them have been controlled, but these are very familiar list. The time, John Graunt and William Petty of England pioneered the use of social statistics, and they began to take measures of infant mortality. They noticed that more boys were born than girls. They collected population data, statistics on disease, a variety of demographics. So here we see that prior to 1750, only approximately 4 out of 5 births produced a live baby in France, and it was only 7 out of 10 in Switzerland. Life expectancy was short. People lived on the average to be only about 30 years old. Of course, there were many people who were older, but the averages, influenced by how many young persons died very early in their life, 40% of children died of some sort of a disease before they reached the age of 15. Well, because the Renaissance was a time of urban growth and development and populations increasing, the management of these masses became important. The spread of plague or epidemics, as well as social unrest and troubles, attacks of the mob, and so forth, all became part of what was required to govern effectively. So, about this same time, both the governments and the guilds began to regulate the medical profession. The Black Death was the principal plague. It was a bubonic plague spread by rats, and it was an epidemic that came to Europe many times during the period from 1347 to 1351. It resulted in the death of about 1/4 of the entire population of Europe. Must have been extraordinary. This was the beginning of a cycle of plagues in Europe that continued well into the 18th century. Now what you see here in the image is Marseille in France, and it was to be devastated somewhat later by an outbreak of the plague. The guilds oversaw apprenticeship of people who would study with a physician to become a physician themselves. In some regions they actually conferred a license. The government had oversight over the universities, and the university tried to train physicians, and those physicians sometimes received appointments from the court. In other regions it was the government that conferred a license to practice medicine. Well, medicine was provided by religious organizations and charitable organizations. In Europe, this was primarily run by the church. They cared for the poor who happened to be ill. They frequently took in abandoned children and women, widows who no longer had a husband to support the family. This revitalized church was eager to reform its charitable institutions, and so we see organizations like the Company of the Holy Sacrament, Hotel Dieu, the development and the founding of the Daughters of Charity. The Company of the Holy Sacrament was founded in Paris in 1629. At the time, vagrants were supposed to be reformed by punishment. It was the deserving poor who were given shelter, and what that shelter included was a requirement for religious discipline, forced labor, and what happened was the beggars and the insane, orphans, petty thieves, prostitutes, unmarried mothers, chronic sick were all confined. By 1700, only some 70 years later, there were more than 100 of these general hospitals. The Daughters of Charity were founded in 1633 by St. Vincent de Paul and Louise de Marillac. The sisters, the nuns, often came from poor families who had offered their daughters away to be cared for in another fashion. These nuns had a certain amount of nursing skills. They knew how to deal with drugs. They could perform simple surgical procedures, and the schooling was provided for the sisters. The Hotel Dieu was considered the hospital of God. It was a large city hospital. It had its own surgeons and physicians. It was a place that was used by the poor, again, who happened to be sick. Because their capabilities were limited, they actually rejected infectious patients. The Hotel Dieu in Paris is the most famous of them and has existed for continuously for many, many years. But there were Hotel Dieu facilities in many cities. This one is in Beaune, France. It was built in 1443. The building still exists today with this colorful roof and decorative architecture that is really quite fantastic. And you see inside the types of facilities that were available in these cabinets that had essentially a bed and a curtain in the form of a box that contained warmth and so forth for the patients that would be placed there. This engraving from the early 1500s, this woodcut, shows what the Hotel Dieu experience might have been like. You see patients, multiple patients in a bed. One of the more interesting aspects of this is to see how completely prominent the crucifix is located in this facility. Well, the nobility and the wealthy build and run these post-Reformation wards that were essentially smaller and dealt with smaller groups of people. The church had become less able to care for the sick, and so these are the beginnings of the voluntary hospitals.